3:15 a.m., June the 22nd, 1941, German Wehrmacht forces launch Operation Barbarossa and invade the Soviet Union, what was and still is the largest military offensive in human history. Nearly 4 million soldiers, 3,000 tanks, 7,000 artillery pieces, and 2,500 aircraft led the charge across Russia's western border, taking the Red Army completely by surprise and laying waste to all those who stood before. The Eastern Front of the Second World War witnessed some of the most brutal and ferocious fighting to ever take place in the history of warfare. The fear of annihilation loomed ominously over Moscow as the German blitzkrieg paved a path of Soviet blood to within a strategic stone's throw of the Kremlin's gates. Their lack of sufficiently available tanks and anti-tank weaponry rendered all attempts to repel the German invasion futile, as scores of well-drilled and well-coordinated panzer brigades carved a beeline for the Russian heartland. Germany's initial successes in the east led many to believe the victory was all but inevitable. Every passing hour German armor stood unopposed spelt catastrophe for Soviet ground forces, whom without an immediate and effective countermeasure could hope for little more than a swift and crushing defeat. Desperate times called for desperate measures. The solution to the Soviets' problem presented itself not in the form of a tank or a gun, but a bomb. Only this was a bomb unlike any seen before, a bomb which far transcended conventional notions of warfare and morality, a bomb with 4 legs, a tail, and a one-way trip to the great beyond. Anti-tank dogs, known as Hundmeinen, literally translating to dogmine in German, were specially trained dogs, typically Alsatian German shepherds, that were conditioned to dive beneath advancing German tanks and deliver an explosive payload to incapacitate or destroy the target, and in doing so, make the ultimate sacrifice. Following the bloodshed of the Russian Civil War and the victory of the Soviets over the White Army, the Red Army was faced with the colossal challenge of reforming and readapting its military for the impending tribulations of 20th century warfare. In 1924, the Revolutionary Military Council of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics approved the introduction of dogs as military equipment within the Red Army for a variety of roles. These included search and rescue operations, delivery of first aid, rapid communications, sniffing out mines, transporting food, assisting in combat, and even transporting injured soldiers to rear lines via sled. The transformation from Stalin's little helper to, well, Sparky is one that occurred as a result of the then still growing, albeit underdeveloped, Soviet military complex. The Red Army lacked any proper response to the newly developing military tactics of using mainly tank-based forces to break through the enemy line. A response would later come in the form of the infamous T-34 medium tank and PTRD-41 anti-tank rifle, but for the meantime, infantry lacked a consistent and effective way to combat this predominantly mechanical force. It was in these early stages of the Great Patriotic War that the Red Army was stained a maniacal shade of red in the blood of its fellow comrades. In a little under 6 months, in excess of 800,000 Soviet soldiers and civilians were killed in action, a figure which would skyrocket to 27 million before the war's end in 1945. During the Great Patriotic War of 1941 to 1945, some 60,000 dogs were handed over to the Red Army by amateur dog breeders who were trained in specialized schools prior to deployment on Russia's Western Front. Training took place at a newly founded dog training center in the Moscow Oblast, the first of 12 academies that would open in close succession. German shepherds were the main target of the program due to their agility, resilience, and ease of training. Of these 12 new training centers, 3 pertained specifically to the training of anti-tank dogs, a number which would dramatically increase as the war in the East unfolded. There was, however, one glaring problem. At the time, the Red Army was seriously lacking in personnel with any measure of conventional dog training credentials, and so they got creative and began recruiting those with varying degrees of dog handling experience. Police officers, hunters, even circus trainers were soon enlisted to swell the ranks of these all-new cutting-edge canine battalions, which included the participation of several leading animal psychologists. Now, if you're wondering how the handlers trained dogs to dive under enemy tanks and subsequently blow everything, including themselves, to smithereens, then the answer is as simple as it is sadistic. classical conditioning. Pavlov's theory suggests that you can condition both humans and animals to associate a reward with an action. The example Pavlov used was ringing a bell whenever a dog was fed. The dog would salivate when it heard the bell, as it would associate the noise with the food. This is what's known as a conditioned response. Adopting this theory to twisted effect, they would half-starve the dogs and then place food beneath a stationary tank. Over time, the dogs would be conditioned to instinctively search beneath the tanks for food. The tanks were at first left standing still, then they had their engines running, which was further combined with sporadic blank-shot gunfire and other battle-related distractions. This routine aimed to teach the dogs to run under the tanks in battlefield situations. Numerous prototypes of the mine vests were trialed, with the initial models being detachable. The initial plan was for the dogs to dive beneath the tanks, bite a release mechanism which released the bomb, at which point the dog would then return to the handler unscathed. The bomb would then be detonated via a timer or remote detonator. As with many things Soviet, this seemed like a good idea in theory, but in practicality, there stood numerous factors which inhibited the success of such a weapon. A group of dogs practiced this for 6 months, though reports determined that none could perform the task consistently. The use of remote-controlled detonators proved largely impractical for the scale of operations intended, as early models were both primitive and scarcely available. To improve viability of such a weapon, amendments were implemented to make training considerably safer and easier for the handlers, that is. Depending on your sources, each dog was fitted with a mine weighing anywhere from 4.5 to 12 kilos, that's 10 to 26 pounds, that was carried on either side of the dog in 2 adjustable pouches. The device would detonate when a lever protruding from the harness, some 20 centimeters in length, hits the low-lying parts of the chassis and is pushed backwards, releasing a safety pin which strikes the detonator. Putting to one side the blatant barbarity and sadistic opportunism that's evocative of sacrificing man's best friend for strategic military gains, there's reason to believe that Stalin's canine kamikaze comrades did in fact make a substantially more significant contribution than arbitrary knowledge would have you believe. Much of the history surrounding the effectiveness of anti-tank dogs is largely fabricated and shrouded in misconceptions. This can be attributed to the anti-Soviet propaganda cultivated by the Wehrmacht forces during the war. Contrary to popular belief, Soviet anti-tank dogs predate the launch of Operation Barbarossa by less than a decade, with the first dedicated anti-tank dog training schools emerging in 1935. Such a revelation debunks the long-held misconception that the emergence of such a weapon was, in fact, the result of a short-sighted and desperate attempt to halt the German armored invasion. This is confirmed in an address to the chief of the 2nd Department of the Main Auto Armored Directorate, GABTU, and the Armored Tank Directorate, BTU, a department within the former, dated July 1941. Military engineer 2nd grade Comrade Demyanenko writes, "I report that trained dogs carrying an anti-tank pouch filled with high explosives can be considered a viable method of combat with enemy tanks. Trials of this anti-tank method were conducted by the Communications Directorate and Engineering and Armored Directorate in 1939 to 1940. The results of the trials proved this method is effective." It's widely speculated that upon deployment to the front lines, anti-tank dogs proved disastrously ineffective, as they would instinctively dive between the friendly, familiar-smelling Soviet diesel engine tanks which had been used during training, as opposed to the foreign aroma of the petrol engine panzers deployed by the Germans. This was allegedly the cause of innumerable friendly fire incidents whereby Red Army tanks would fall prey to the explosive payloads of the mine dogs. In reality, anti-tank dogs were assigned to infantry units that did not receive artillery or tank support, rendering the claim as nothing more than an urban legend. Additionally, there were only a few Soviet tank models which utilized diesel engines in 1941, as the vast majority of tanks fielded by the Red Army at this time, albeit outmatched in most regards, ran on petrol. In further contrast, the diesel-powered tanks and armored fighting vehicles fielded by Soviet forces at this time, such as T-34KV and BT-7M, were relatively new designs that were only deployed in scarce quantities where urgent support was needed the most. These cutting-edge combat machines allowed the Red Army to face their adversaries on even footing, where previous engagements proved devastatingly one-sided. The notion that the Soviets would prioritize this inconceivably important lifeline for dog training over frontline service is outright preposterous, and would have been second only in sacrifice to strapping explosives to the soldiers themselves. Of this, the Soviets were well aware, and rightfully designated the use of their aging, insufficiently armored, and now largely obsolete T-18 light tanks for use in the training of anti-tank dogs. The tank which, by the way, uses a petrol engine. This too is confirmed in the previously mentioned address to the GABTU and the BTU stating, on the BTU KA proving grounds at the Kabinka station, an MS-1 T-18 tank moving at second gear was destroyed by a dog carrying an AT pouch, which caused the following damage: torn track, torn out tank side, torn off and destroyed drive wheel, damaged the upper front plate and lower hull, tank turret torn off. During all other trials with dummy pouches, dogs dove under a moving tank without fail. It's also worth noting that where available, captured German panzers would be used in the training of anti-tank dogs. Fido's baptism of fire came in late 1941, following the German surge to the Russian capital, codenamed Operation Typhoon. Anti-tank dogs of the 1st Special Battalion were first deployed in battle near Moscow, comprising 212 dogs and 199 handlers. It's said that every dog has his day, and this was no exception. Only this was a day marked by untold death and cataclysmic disaster. The dogs' first major engagement proved utterly shambolic. The lack of cover fire from Soviet infantry proved fatal as, one by one, the charging dogs fell prey to German bullets as they ran towards their targets, resulting in the annihilation of almost all the dogs without so much as a single enemy target destroyed. Those soldiers who weren't killed surrendered with their dogs. During interrogations, the captive handlers revealed the Soviet methods used to train their four-legged companions. Such information was utilized as propaganda among German troops who vilified the Soviets as cowards, claiming they would rather sacrifice their own dogs than fight like men. Despite the decimation of the 1st Special Battalion, the Soviet Union doubled down in their efforts and continued to use dogs against the Germans. By the end of 1941, over 1,000 anti-tank dogs were engaged in frontline combat. Just a year later, that number would rise to more than double. Future encounters, however, would prove more successful. On July the 21st, 1942, anti-tank dogs would help determine the outcome of a major battle near Tagarog on the Sea of Azov. When 40 enemy panzers smashed through a battery of anti-tank guns and compromised the position of the Naval Infantry Brigade, the 4th Company of anti-tank dogs was the only thing that stood between the command post and the advancing German armor. Simultaneously, 56 dogs launched an attack that destroyed a significant number of enemy tanks. Not only did those dogs stop the offensive, but they also forced the Germans to flee the battlefield. In other instances, it's reported that in the sector of the 160th Infantry Division in the vicinity of Glukovo, 6 anti-tank dogs managed to destroy a total of 5 enemy tanks. At Stalingrad, in the vicinity of the airfield, a squad of tank destroyer dogs destroyed 13 enemy tanks. At Kursk, in the zone of the 6th Guards Army, 16 dogs destroyed 12 tanks that had broken through the depths of the Soviet defenses in the area of Tamarovka. But with figures like these in mind, it's difficult to dispute the viability of such a weapon, especially when considering the financial and logistical benefits when compared to more conventional anti-tank weaponry. Official Soviet figures estimate that the adoption of anti-tank dogs contributed to the destruction of over 300 enemy tanks and armored fighting vehicles, though the true figure is likely unknown, especially considering that it's equally as likely that the Soviet authorities may have inflated these figures in an effort to justify such morally abstruse actions in the aftermath of the war. There were also, however, grievous psychological issues for Soviet soldiers. The dog trainers and handlers began to rebel at the cruelty involved in what was essentially the intentional cold-blooded murder of the dogs that they'd served with and had often formed an emotional bond with. If, as was sometimes common in a particularly fierce battle, a dog turned away from the tank and started to run back toward the Soviet trenches to prevent injury to the soldiers should the bomb detonate, returning dogs had to be shot, often by the very soldiers who had cared for them. Even if the dog was successful in destroying the enemy target, the trainers had to watch an animal they were fond of and perhaps even grew to love be blown to pieces right in front of their eyes. For many Soviet dog handlers, this was simply too much, resulting in many of them being unwilling to work with new dogs. Some questioned the morality of their superiors, complaining that the army was not content with merely sacrificing people to the war, but felt that it was necessary to slaughter innocent, trusting dogs as well. Those soldiers who openly criticized the anti-tank dog program or voiced concerns over the integrity of such inhumane treatment toward the animals were often reprimanded in the harshest of ways, and more often than not, sent to the Gulag. From late 1941 onward, German forces were well aware of the Hundmine and peril and took precautionary measures to defend against it. The machine guns mounted on the armored vehicles proved generally ineffective due to the relatively small size of the dogs, not least to mention the speed of the Alsatians and their low proximity to the ground. The solution, you could say, was no less moral than the problem that birthed it. Orders were eventually issued to all German soldiers on the front lines to shoot any dog that they saw in a combat area. In some cases, the entire canine populations of Russian villages were apprehended, taken from families against their will, rounded up outside, and shot dead. By mid-1943, the war in the East was beginning to change. At long last, the Red Army was finally starting to receive the sufficient quantities of vitally needed anti-tank weapons, which they'd been so urgently lacking in the early years of the war. As a result, Soviet forces had stopped using dogs for suicide missions and begun the process of reintegrating and retraining existing dogs for use in a variety of more conventional roles, such as mine detection. With our modern, more enlightened sensibilities, it's easy to look back in condemnation of the actions of wartime Russia, to deem those who decreed such moralless actions as cold-hearted monsters, void of any semblance of compassion and empathy for our canine companions. While the Soviet Union is the only nation who utilized anti-tank dogs on a practical and industrial level, there were, in fact, other countries who at the very least considered the viability of such a weapon, going so far as to train specialized dog units for such an occasion in a remarkably similar fashion to that of the Soviets, namely the USA. Instead of blowing up tanks and AMVs like the Soviets, the targets of the Hundmeinen's American cousins were instead Japanese bunkers. Thankfully, however, the Americans saw the danger in the program before they approved it. In the limited simulations they ran, many dogs returned to their masters with what was quite literally a ticking bomb still attached, as opposed to remaining in the enemy bunkers. Anti-tank dog training continued in Russia until 1996, but there are no reports of them being used outside the limited window of the Second World War. The latest account of a bomb-laden animal being used in a military conflict was in July 2014, when Hamas militants attempted to attack Israeli troops in Gaza with a donkey carrying concealed explosives. Unfortunately, many Soviet dogs laid down their lives in the line of service during the war, and perhaps, given the ultimate conclusion of the conflict and the triumph of the Russians over Nazi Germany, there's reason to believe that the sacrifices made by man's best friend made a considerable difference, and in doing so, inadvertently saved countless Russian lives. But nonetheless, the events that unfolded in those turbulent years of the conflict will forever remain a stain on the garment of human morality and serve as a testament to the limits of human depravity, and hopefully act as a reminder of the evolution in sensibilities that we've attained since, and will hopefully never repeat again.